Welcome to something you've never seen before. The UAFL Sportsball, Weeks 1 and 2 edition for Season 2. Now, out of all the access football leagues there are, the UAFL is the only one that's going to be doing stuff like this, unless if the XAFL begins to do it too. Or I could do the XAFL as well, because why not? But we are going to be discussing every single game that happened in both League 1 and League 2 in the UAFL in the last 2 weeks of the season, which is basically 4 days per week in reality. But let's time travel to the beginning. Week 1. Cleveland Coyotes versus Indianapolis Gladiators. I don't even know what to say about this game. The Coyotes sucked this game, and they somehow even managed to get blown out by the Indianapolis Gladiators, who placed third to last in the standings last season in League 1. Somehow Indianapolis avoided relegation. What's more important is that they've won the game. They've actually won their first game of the season this day. How did the Coyotes lose? I don't even know. They suffered miserably, and their offense sucks in that game. So here's a special award I want to give to you. Lol Cow. You are the Week 1 Lol Cow of the week. I know, the first game I discuss is already Lol Cow. Let's move on to the next one. The Cyclones and the Express. The Cyclones just got relegated from the XAFL down to League 1, but that doesn't mean they're not a bad team. They managed to strike down Philly, who choked their seasons away last season. And with their poor decision-making and interceptions, they only managed to get 49 rushing yards. They have thrown 3 turnovers in the entire game, making it another game of misery for Philadelphia. Okay, Tennessee versus Montreal. The Montreal Terrapins almost choked this game away to one of the worst teams in the league. However, they managed to prevail, as they were just promoted out of League 2 to play in this league. As the Terrapins have won by a decent amount, which is 10, and ended up becoming, first place in the league at the end of Week 1. Or not the league, of the division. Of the Eastern Division. Detroit versus Cincinnati. It's no surprise that Detroit is losing, but by only 7? Cincinnati has not been playing good in this past week, in Week 1. What is left of Cincinnati is shreds after being eliminated out of the playoffs in the first round. And now they're in the most mediocrity of teams in this league. However, Detroit, they did pretty well in this game, because they managed to almost win, but they came short and lost, just like they always do. Next is Kansas City versus Winnipeg. Kansas City managed to win against Winnipeg late in the game. While Winnipeg may be new to the league, Kansas City is a very good team, meaning beating them is a challenge. So even for Winnipeg in this case.
Oh, there goes, I got it to work.
Next up is the Sharks versus the Jags. Somehow the Jags sold this game and ended up losing to the Sharks. The Sharks are not a very good team, but they were good enough to make the play-ins last season, but did not prevail in the play-ins and ended up going to one of the relegation tournaments, but succeeded in that relegation tournament to avoid relegation. Now the Sharks have made a nice upset against the Jaguars, but the Jaguars aren't that much better than the Sharks. As the Jags were, I believe, sixth. They were sixth seed last season. Then the reason why they've gotten sixth seed is because they beaten the Royals in the second round in the play-in tournament. All right, moving on to the next game. Denver and Miami, the relegation bowl of the UAFL. Two teams from the XAFL who have been previously relegated are playing each other once again. And this time, Denver prevails. Denver has some problems on their own hands, but so does Miami. Both teams are bad. They both are mediocre. But they're not as bad as some of the other teams in this league. So this is truly where we think so far both of these teams should stay. Lawman versus Grizzlies. We call them the Grizzlies because we don't like the other name because it's racist. The Lawmen managed to do the norm and win against Buffalo, but not in the way they normally do. They normally screw the daylights out of them. They may have shut them out, but they only scored 10 points doing so. So it's not a blowout shutout. As their quarterback has been sacked 5 times this game. 5 times. But that doesn't beat how Buffalo's quarterback is such a moron that he forces 6 interceptions. 6! This is the definition of a bad team. You know dang well you ain't going to have a good season if you're going to be losing games like that. Moving on to the minor leagues in Week 1. And moving on to UAFL League 2. This is probably one of the worst games I've ever watched, ever, of Access Football. Both offenses are terrible. They can't even get down the field. In fact, this 7 was not from the offense. It was from a pick 6. That's how mediocre they are. There was not a single offensive touchdown in this entire game. It was turnover after turnover after turnover after turnover. And it was absolute mediocrity. The Gators and the Mallards both deserve to stay in League 2 after what I've seen out of that game. Absolute mediocrity. Week 1 is their demise in this season. It's no doubt. And then moving on to New York versus Washington. Two teams that actually can still play football in League 2. So we might expect these two teams to return to the league. Because New York, even though they lost, they did better than Vancouver and Louisiana combined in points scored. And as for Washington, they blew out the Barons, meaning they could be returning to League 2 next season. Same with New York. However, they have to work on their offensive line because Washington's offensive line is absolutely horrible, as their quarterback has been sacked 4 times. but there was very little turnovers in this game from each team. And then moving on to week 2, we start off with the biggest upset I've ever seen in this league. Indianapolis wins a game against a former ex-AFL team, the Oklahoma City Cyclones. How is this possible? I don't even know. Other than the fact that the OKC quarterback's been sacked 5 times. There was no turnovers in this game, which means the Indianapolis defense played well this game. And believe it or not, the Gladiators are 2-0 and are first place in the entire league. Something that usually never happens. They both played very well, and it ended up coming down to Indianapolis winning by a field goal. Well, really by 2 points, but that's because they missed an extra pointer. Moving on, Cleveland versus Tennessee. Cleveland may still suck, but they almost lost to Tennessee, a team that is relatively bad at access. Cleveland may be the definition of a new era of Cleveland, the sucky era. The era where they just are in an endless loop of losses. After loss, after loss. However, they managed to win, still by 10. Even though they never sacked the Tennessee quarterback in this entire game. But that doesn't also mean that Tennessee is safe either. Their quarterback threw 3 interceptions in the game. But not as bad as that other one with 6. Cleveland pretty much sucks with passing, but Tennessee can't even run the football. Philadelphia versus Detroit. Philly, well, even though they're kind of mediocre, Detroit, again, is even more mediocre. Meaning, this game is not a surprise, a loss for the Detroit Firebirds. However, the Express, you still got a tough season, as you are now 1-1. In fact, most of the teams in the league are 1-1, so you should be happy, because a very few amount of teams are 2-0, as there's only 3. And a couple of teams are 0-2. Coming up with this next game isn't a surprise at all. Montreal just winning against Denver. However, Montreal almost choked this game again, but didn't manage to lose. As now, the Montreal Terrapins are the last team to be unbeaten in the East Division. However, their quarterback may have earned themselves a title. They've earned themselves the ability to sack her, because they can sack Denver more than they can throw interceptions, as both teams threw interceptions, 2 each. But here, let's talk about the problems of both of these teams. Both teams' rushing sucks, as they got under 100 yards under that category. So maybe you need a new running back. We'll see if you get one whenever Access 23 comes out. Moving on to the next game, Cincinnati versus Kansas City. This game was actually a close game, so Cincinnati did better than they did last week. They didn't fall to rumbles like they usually do. However, they still lost. And they lost because their quarterback sucks and threw 3 interceptions. Maybe you need a new quarterback. One with a better logic. Because Kansas City managed to throw 0 interceptions. Brilliant stuff. And they even totaled less yards than Cincinnati did. And Cincinnati still lost. That's just proof that Cincinnati needs help. Moving on to Miami versus the Sharks. Don't even get me started. The Sharks' offense was so bad the entire game. And their defense couldn't stop the football from a team known as Miami. A team who's been going through relegation recently. And is now destroying opponents like the Sharks. The Sharks may have some thinking to do. Because they earned themselves lolcow of week 2. Congratulations, you have earned yourself an award of shame. Let's see who wins it in week 3. But that's not coming up until... But there's going to be another video for that. Moving on to one of the minor league games, it's a blowout against the Gators, who actually scored more points than they did against Vancouver. However, Louisiana still lost by over 18 points by getting sacked 4 times and throwing 3 picks. Brilliant stuff. What makes this better is that they can't even freaking pass. They didn't even get 200 yards. They only had 50 passing yards. Congratulations. If you got lucky that you weren't the lolcow of the week. Because if it wasn't for the Sharks, it would have been you. Moving on to Winnipeg versus, back in League One, let's get Winnipeg versus Dallas. Winnipeg has a big win under their hands as they defeated the Dallas Lawmen, who was 5th place last season in the standings. Now keep in mind, you should see them as a 3rd place team because 2 teams, or actually no, you should see them as a 2nd place team because 3 teams got promoted out of the league, including Nebraska. That would include Nebraska, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Which would mean if you were to beat them, Winnipeg would be one of the best teams in the league. Oh, and Montreal's expected to head in that same direction. Which could only mean predictions of the future. Promotion for both the Winnipeg and Montreal to the XAFL. Yep, that's right. It's predicted that Canada is finally coming to the XAFL. Which is something that's never happened at all. Other than the XAFL minor leagues. Because you know very well Montreal's better than Winnipeg. But if Winnipeg is better than Dallas, we're bound to see both of these Canadian teams in the playoffs. Moving on to the Jags and versus Buffalo. The Jaguars lost again, this time to the Buffalo Grizzlies, who literally placed 8th place in the standings. The Jags' mediocrity continues as they are the only team in the West to be winless. Their defensive line may have been good, but everything else is mediocrity. How do you finish a game with 11 points? Simple. You have to suck to do that. Like, this is the scoregami of the season. Moving on. is the end of the video. For those of you wondering what we've been witnessing this week, some teams may be good, some teams may be bad, and the new teams that got promoted out of League 2 are better than almost all the teams in League 1 already. Maybe it's time for promotion. Because Montreal is 2-0, and Winnipeg was unlucky for 1 week, but ended up winning against Oklahoma City. Well, actually, no, it wasn't them. It was Indianapolis that beat them. So, if Indianapolis continues their streak, what will happen? We have no clue, but I doubt the Gladiators are going to win much more. And this will close out this week's edition of, or this bi-weekly cycle of Sportsball for the UAFL Season 2. See you guys after the end of Week 4.